Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. My name's Mel. Thank you so much for joining me today for some books you might not have heard of. What I'm going to do today is something a little bit different, and I wanted to talk about some books that aren't super hyped up at the moment. Some of these books might be books that you have heard of but you haven't heard anything much of recently, or some of these books might be books that you just haven't come across before. Obviously, when books are released, they are marketed, and so new releases get a lot of hype at the time, and so older releases tend to sort of fall out of favour. There are books that are super hyped for various reasons. Previous books that the author has written have been received really well, really popular. Booktubers or bookstagrammers or booktalkers have been talking about them a lot, and so they get a lot of traction that way. There are a number of different reasons why books get very hyped and get talked about a lot, but I do think that there are some absolutely amazing books that aren't necessarily talked about, that people don't necessarily find out about or know about. I'm not going to say, like I said, that these books are books you may have never heard of. Some of you may have heard of these books before, particularly if you've been around my channel for a while. You've probably heard of most of these books, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to some underhyped books. So like I said, some of these books, it might simply be that they are older books that were published some time ago, and so potentially at the time they were talked about in various different ways and various different social media platforms, in marketing in general, in the publishing industry, etc., but they haven't been spoken about much recently. Mostly that's going to be due to the fact, like I said, that there are books that are being released and that are taking their places. Some of these, in fact, I don't have any books that are new releases that I don't think people are talking about, partly because I don't tend to pay that much attention to what's coming out. I don't look at gimmicks or look at the various different upcoming books. I tend to get that information off YouTube and off you guys, so I hear the same information that a lot of us hear, the booktubers that I follow. Anyway, let's stop rambling and let's just dive straight on in. The first book, there's no particular order, I should say, to how I'm doing this. It's really just the stack that I've gotten myself here. So the first book is going to be one that is more a case of, it's quite an old book now. It hasn't been spoken about recently because it was published a while ago. So that is Chocolat by Joanne. There was a movie created of this book as well, I think in the early 2000s, and so it was pretty popular at the time because, as you can tell, it got made into a movie, so I'm sure many of you have heard of this one before. I love this book. I really enjoyed it. I watched the movie first, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and then I had to go and get the book and read it as well. So it was actually published in Doubleday edition was published in 1999 and Black Swan edition was published in 2000. So 22 years ago now. Gosh, that's a thought. I'm not 100% sure how to categorize this book. It is set in France in an unspecified time in France, but it's an historical fiction. But there are some fantasy mystical elements. So I have classified this one as sort of magical realism, but I don't know if you technically would. It's that sort of idea where it's set in our world, but there are fantastical elements in it. It is historical fiction. I love this book. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I love Joanne Harris's writing style. It's not super purple. If you like lyrical writing style, similar, I would say, to B.E. Schwab's writing style, particularly in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue and Gallant. Just the style I'm talking about, not the content. Then I think that you would like Joanne Harris's writing style, and in particular Chocolat. In this one we follow a woman who I think is in her late 20s, and she moves to this town that is very straight-laced, all about following the edicts of the church, and there is a priest and a mayor who are both, well, actually I'm trying to think, I'm getting the movie and the book a bit mixed up. There's a priest who is sort of in charge of overseeing everyone's, the way they comport themselves, and Vianne is a very free-spirited, carefree person. She's not Catholic, she doesn't follow any Catholic or Christian faith, but she has some sort of spirituality that is, I believe, stemmed from South American Aztecs, and that part of the world. But yeah, she arrives just in time for Lent and opens a chocolate shop, and that causes all sorts of mayhem, and yeah, it's just beautifully written, really fun, and there's a lot of deep stuff in here as well, to do with domestic violence and violence against women, and I just think it was done beautifully, and yeah, like I said, I absolutely love her writing style. Highly recommend, and I do think people should be talking about this one, even though it's a fairly old book, because it's fantastic. The next book that I wanted to show you was The Interrogation of Ashala Wolf by Ambellin Kwaymullina. If you've been around my channel for a while, you would have seen this crop up a few times. I keep putting the second book in the trilogy on my TBR and just not getting to it. Not because I don't want to read it, but just because I just haven't got around to it yet, for I don't know even what reason, but anyway. This was actually published in 2012, so partly it's probably that it doesn't get the hype because it's a bit of an older book now, but I also do think that it is an Australian book and it's written by an Australian Aboriginal author, and I do feel that Australian books on a world market aren't necessarily super publicised, but then particularly Indigenous authors don't get the traction as other Australian authors and other white authors. I really enjoyed this book. It is a young adult dystopian novel, so it takes place in a future world which is very reminiscent of Australia. It's not said on page that it is specifically Australia, but it's definitely, the landscape is very much like Australia. And there are people in this universe who have different powers, and are able to do a bunch of different things. Some have memory powers, different things, just all sorts of different kind of supernatural power. Ashala Wolf runs away from kind of the mainstream because those people with those powers are considered to be not normal and are kind of hunted down and imprisoned, and Ashala runs away and finds herself setting up this organisation, this group of people called the Tribe, and she's kind of one of the head of the tribe, and then it's about her being captured by, yeah, the people in charge of the world. I have in the past compared this to The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I do think there are some similarities in the structure of the book and the content of the book, so the whole idea of having kind of supernatural powers. Shala's powers are clairvoyant type powers as well, and the idea of being considered outcasts. But yeah, I think that if you enjoyed The Bone Season, you would enjoy this one. This is a little bit younger, I think, but I still think is incredibly well written and really interesting. There are 3 books. This is a trilogy. I definitely intend to read the other 2 books, but like I said, I just keep not getting to them. But I would highly recommend this trilogy. And yeah, this is another book that I think that a lot of people probably haven't heard that much about, if anything. So next up we have Shards of Honor by Lois McMaster Bujold. It says on here that this is a New York Times best-selling author. So this author has done pretty well for themselves, which suggests to me that it's probably has had its day. It was published in 1986. So that would explain a lot why a lot of people aren't talking about it at the moment. Yeah, it's had its day and people just aren't talking about it. It is not in the minds of people. They're looking at newer books, but I do think that it is worth your time. So it is a sort of space war adventure story, and it is about a woman called Cordelia who works for the Beaten Expeditionary Force, and it's about 2 different alien races who are in battle with each other, but it is also about the politics of what's going on in the world and this woman finding herself somehow embroiled in those politics even though she doesn't want to be. And yeah, I thought it was really well written. I really enjoyed it. It's been a little while since I've read it, so I can't remember a lot about it, but I remember finding it really interesting and a little bit different from what I expected. There's a lot more of the politics. There's a lot more about her and her characterization, and and it's a lot more thoughtful than I was expecting it to be. I was expecting it to be a bit more of just a space action Starship Troopers type of book, but there was a little bit more going on than that. So yeah, I would recommend if you like that sort of science fiction, fun, adventure, action kind of book. And I do have some more of this series which I do intend to read at some point, but science fiction isn't necessarily my go-to genre, so it kind of has taken a backseat, but at some point I will read them. And yeah, but this is a book that I think that probably at this time, 40 something years later, or 30 something years later, probably not many people are talking about, but and may not have heard of, but yeah, I recommend you give it a shot. The next book that I have is a book that was reasonably recently published, so 2018, so that's still 4 years ago, but not as long ago as some of the other books that I've talked about, and that is Wimmera by Mark Brandi. This has actually won 2 Australian literary awards. It has won Debut Fiction Indie Book and Crime Writers Association Debut Dagger Award, and it was also shortlisted for Literary Fiction Book of the Year and the Matt Ritchell Award for New Writer of the Year. So it's done really well for itself in literary circles within Australia, but I don't think that it has picked up quite as much traction outside of Australia. Partly I think that is because it's an Australian book, it's an indie Australian book, it is published by, well, it's now published by Hatchet, but I think it was published by, I'm not sure, but it says it's indie, so yeah. But anyway, I don't think as well known as some of the other bigger publishing houses, so it doesn't have the sort of inherent marketing behind it, but also being Australian and it being literary fiction, it's probably not going to be as advertised as some of the bigger sort of genre fiction books are and have been. I really enjoyed this one. So this is a mystery about, it's essentially about Fab, and it's about him in his, I think, early 30s, and someone from the police department comes around starting to talk about an old crime that he was aware of, and it's about what happened when he was a child with his best friend. I'm just going to read you this last bit of the blurb. It says, 20 years later, Fab is stuck in the same town, going nowhere but hoping for somewhere better. Then a body is found in the river and Fab can't ignore the past anymore. So it's one of those books that goes from, does flashbacks, goes from present to past, and we follow Fab and his friend Ben back in 1989 and sort of what's going on with them and what's happening to them, and then we go forward in time and talk about what's happening now that this body has been found and how does that relate to them, what could it mean. I really enjoyed this one. Like I said, I thought it was really, really well written, literary crime fiction, so is that the kind of thing that you like the sound of, then I would highly recommend this book. Yeah, highly recommend it as an interesting book that you should give a try. The next 2 books I think are technically classified as classics, modern classics. I'm not 100% sure how things get classified as modern classics as opposed to classics like Jane Austen, which I think are a little bit more obvious. They are popular books that continue to be popular from when they were written, often in the Victorian era up into present day. But then you have more modern classics, and I'm not sure how exactly that gets classified, whether it's, again, a time thing. I'm not really sure. But these 2 are books that I don't really see spoken about on BookTube, at least. Even when people are talking about classics or modern classics, favourite classics, doing classic reading blogs, anything like that, these are 2 that just don't seem to get read or talked about, so I thought that I would bring your attention to them. So the first one of these is Wide Segaso Sea by Jean Rhys. This is an incredibly short book, as you can see. It was published in 1966, so certainly a more modern classic, if that makes sense. I read this for university when I was studying the modern novel, and I read this in conjunction with Jane Eyre because this is actually a Jane Eyre retelling, sort of. It is telling the story of Bertha, the wife in the attic. So if you guys know Jane Eyre, which is a pretty popular classic, so I think a lot of people know generally what that's about. Jane is the governess to the child, I think she's the ward of Mr. Rochester. Essentially, Mr. Rochester has this wife who apparently went crazy, and he's keeping her in the attic because she's crazy. So this is about Bertha, and this talks about Bertha being, well, why don't I read the blurb to you? It says, Jean Rhys's late literary masterpiece, Wine Segaso Sea, was inspired by Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and is set in the lush, beguiling landscape of Jamaica in the 1830s. Born into an oppressive colonialist society, Creole heiress Antoinette Cosway meets a young Englishman who is drawn to her innocent sensuality and beauty. After their marriage, the rumours begin, poisoning her husband against her. Caught between his demands and her own precarious sense of belonging, Antoinette is driven towards madness. So yeah, it is sort of taking the idea of this mad, crazy person in the attic and talking about what might have happened to her, what could have made her crazy. So it's a retelling of The Wife in the Attic. I really enjoyed this one when I read it when I was at university in my early 20s, and we did a compare and contrast to Jane Eyre as part of that course. Yeah, so if you enjoyed Jane Eyre, I think that you should read this one. I think that it is really interesting. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm actually quite keen to give it another read and see what I think of it now. But yeah, this is another book that I would recommend you have a read. The second classic that I have here that I think is not really talked about on BookTube at all, I certainly haven't seen anyone talk about it, although perhaps they have. As with any of these books, I'm not saying that absolutely no one has ever spoken about this. I'm just saying that I don't hear many people, if any people. I don't happen to have come across people talking about these books very much, if at all, so I thought that I would give them a shout out. Anyway, the next one is Midnight's Children by Salmon Rushdie. This one is, like I said, another modern classic. It was published in 1981, so actually published reasonably recently for a modern classic. I don't even know, having said that, whether you would technically necessarily classify this as a modern classic, but that's how I've been classifying it. This is a tricky one to talk about. So this is written as though it were a memoir about Midnight's Children. So the idea is that in India, when they won independence from Britain, which I don't even know when that was, how terrible is that? But the year that that occurred, at midnight of the turning of the year, there were a number of children who were born in India at that time. And because it was such a momentous occasion, and also it was a new beginning, turning of the year, these children were born with various different magical, mystical powers. And it follows them and their magical, mystical powers and how that affects the world. But it starts out actually talking about this one particular person who is one of these children, and it actually talks about their grandparents first of all, and then sort of follows their ancestry from their grandparents down to them when they were born at midnight, and then follows their life and the life of the other Midnight's children and their powers, and yeah, how that affects the world and what was going on, why did they get these powers, etc. Another book that I haven't read for a really long time, but I remember really enjoying it. I actually read it for the same course that I read Wine Segaso Sea for, and I found it really intriguing and really, really interesting. I'm honestly not 100% sure what I would compare this to. It's quite lyrical writing. It's that very kind of meandering literary fiction style of book. It definitely reads like a classic. I just found it really compelling and really interesting. I thought Salmon Rushdie's writing style was very interesting as well. So this is a book that I think you should have a try if those sorts of things sound interesting to you. And finally, I actually have a trilogy that if you have been around on my channel for a while, if you have been part of the Last to Read book club, you will definitely have heard of before, but I do think that there are a number of people who have not heard of this book and these books, and so I want to shout them out because I really, really enjoyed this trilogy, and I do think that they deserve a lot more hype because I think they are fantastic. So the first book is Every Breath by Ellie Marney. The second book is Every Word, also by Ellie Marney, and the third book is Every Move by Ellie Marney as well. I'm just going to hold up the first book. I have comped these three books to the Good Girl's Guide to Murder series in that they are young adult mystery thriller books. These series are set in Australia. Ellie Marney is an Australian author. I do think that them being Australian is probably, again, some of the reason why they're not necessarily as popular as something like Good Girl's Guide to Murder or the books by Maureen Johnson, Truly Devious series. I haven't read the Truly Devious series, but I definitely think that this series can be compared to A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. Mostly, like I said, that they are young adult mystery thrillers. This one is straight prose, however, so don't expect it to have the same structure, but yeah, I do really enjoy this series. I thought it was really well written. I loved the characters in this series, and yeah, just absolutely thoroughly enjoyed this one. We follow our two main characters, and it is actually a Sherlock Holmes John Watson retelling, but instead of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, we have James Moriarty and Rachel Watts. But James is a young man who is a little bit of a sort of social outcast. He has difficulties with different aspects of socializing and working with other people. He's incredibly intelligent with a great deal of interest in forensics, and so he gets involved in this book with a murder, the investigation of a murder, and then the other books follow on with some different murders and different things happening like that. Yeah. Like I said, I thought these were really well written. I love the characters. I think Ellie Marney is a fantastic author, and I do think that this series needs a lot more love and a lot more people reading it, because I think that it's really fantastic and fun and just great. So yeah, those were all the books that for one reason or another I think have not been getting, recently at least, the hype that they deserve, and I thought that I would draw your attention to these books. Let me know in the comments below if you have actually, in fact, heard of these books, read them, what you thought of them. Are there any books that you thought sounded really cool that you'd like to give a read? Please comment all of that below. If you would like to leave me a comment but you don't know what, then leave me a sad face emoji, because I'm sad that these don't get the hype that I think they deserve. All of my social media details are listed in the description below, so if you'd like to go and follow me on any of those other platforms, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would absolutely love it if you would subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. And yeah, like I said, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.